Welcome to Unit 5, Creating Resilient Communities, Part 1. The unit objectives for this week is to explain the importance of leadership in promoting community resilience, to list a 6-step planning process for community resilience, to describe how to form a collaborative planning team, and to determine how to set long-term goals and objectives for community resilience. In order not to get behind in this class, you should have completed all the requirements for Units 1 through 4. This week, you should read Chapter 8 in the Schwab book, and you should read Chapters 1 through 3 in the NIST report. You should also participate in a forum. Identify a community that is working to develop resiliency planning. Describe what they're doing and how it fits into the lessons from Unit 5 readings. As always, the assignment is worth 100 points, and to earn full credit, you must reply to at least 3 of your classmates' posts. You all should be working on Assignment 1. In Assignment 1, you need to draft a memo to the mayor of your community. Include all of the following elements. This is described in the assignments section in Canvas, so be sure to look it up. But you need to discuss lessons from the recent Hurricane Irma on your community, describe the importance of leadership in promoting community resilience, recommend a 6-step planning process for community resilience, and explain the process of forming a collaborative planning team which will help set long-term goals and objectives. This week, you should have read Chapter 8 in the Schwab book. Next steps for creating resilient communities. In this final chapter of the Schwab book, he gives several examples of places where leadership has been critical in creating a resilient outcome after a major disaster. He talks about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, which we talked a fair amount about in last week's lecture. He talked about Greenburgh, Kansas, and how the mayor and others have seized the opportunity in rebuilding after an EF5 tornado in order to reposition the town both environmentally and economically to become nationally recognized example of green post-disaster redevelopment. He gives the example of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which had devastating floods in 2008 and worked in order to rebuild housing after the flood. And in New York City, after Hurricane Sandy, planners worked hard to look at coastal flood mitigation and how the city could rebuild in the context of major hurricanes and climate change. Schwab talks about the American Planning Association, which is the organization that he works for and the organization that published this report. He talked about how the APA has stressed throughout its hazard-related publications and policy guides the need to identify and act upon the benefits that come from disasters, which he calls the silver linings. Of course, disasters are not inherently desirable or good things that we want to see happen, but they do happen. And how we respond to those disasters and how we learn from those disasters, and critically important for this week's readings, how we become resilient in the aftermath of disasters for future disasters is what is most important. This leads us to the concept of adaptive thinking. Adaptive thinking is important in a post-disaster recovery context. This actually comes from the medical arena, where a physician, Robert Goldman from Chicago, who was a physician and surgeon, wrote about brain health. And he looked at the concepts of objectively, which is focusing mainly on facts, the statistics, and the hard information available. Adaptive thinking is critically, which looks at analyzing a situation for possible drawbacks and asking, what's the downside? Being positive or positively, finding the benefits, solutions, and new possibilities in a situation, or in other words, asking, what's the upside? Creatively, generating new ideas, applying novel or unusual remedies to a problem. Intuitively, reacting on the basis of your emotions or instincts. And self-mentoring, which is examining how one thinks to find any bias or flawed assumptions in the analysis of a problem, or in other words, thinking about how one thinks. Schwab notes that these concepts are critical for planners and allied professions in the community when they're called upon to think critically about the problems that arise from natural hazards. He then goes on, after describing in more detail each of these concepts, to talk about the concept of sustainability, the future of planning for resilience. The sustainability concept was first defined in 1987 by the United Nations Brundtland Commission. Definition is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. He notes that planners and their communities should strive for both resilience and sustainability. He talks about environmental change towards the end of this chapter. Environmental change, recognizing climate change, sea level rise, and how studies are documenting how the environment is changing and what's going to happen in the next few decades. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been a key player in putting the scientific evidence together, demonstrating the warming of the globe, which has impacts to agriculture, creates more storm activity, creates drought, creates all sorts of issues that we need to apply the concepts of sustainability and resilience to. Schwab notes that both the spatial and the temporal scales of climate change are well beyond the short-term climatic conditions that most people perceive on a daily basis. If communities are to remain resilient and sustainable into an extended future, climate change must become a consideration with regard to both hazard mitigation planning and pre- and post-disaster recovery planning. He notes in some communities, marshaling public awareness of the issue is clearly easier than in others. It's become a polarizing issue, and the very polarization itself has become an obstacle to having a public conversation about the impacts of climate change. So, in the end, Schwab talks about really the importance of the need for planners to work together, to educate, to bring communities into these conversations. And he ends up the entire book with a paragraph. He says, bringing it all together. Schwab states, in the end, the opportunity to combine aspects of community economic revitalization with environmental restoration and serious considerations of social equity, particularly in the context of adapting communities for a future of greater climate resilience and adaptation, draws upon some of the most powerful, creative, and visionary skill sets that planners can offer to a community. He goes on and he says, it's incumbent upon the planning profession to rise to this opportunity while realizing that disasters, with all human, economic, and environmental loss they represent, are sobering reminders of all that society may not have gotten quite right, or right at all, in the way it has chosen to build in the past. When communities push the reset button after a disaster, they need to do so thoughtfully but creatively, with an eye on the high price already paid for placing too much of the built environment in harm's way. It is not enough, not nearly enough, merely to repeat the mistakes of the past. NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, put out a special publication called Community Resilience Planning Guide for Buildings and Infrastructure Systems, Volume 1. I'd like to show you a quick overview of what NIST is doing in terms of resilience. They are absolutely one of the leaders in terms of federal agencies who are promoting the concept of resilience and doing research and figuring out plans and policies to implement resilience at the national level across the United States and certainly within communities.
Direct strike of a potentially catastrophic and life-threatening hurricane expected late tonight. Mandatory evacuation is in progress.
Disasters happen. We can't stop hurricanes, earthquakes, and other hazardous events from happening. But we can take steps to make our communities more resilient. Through research at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, we're finding ways to make homes, buildings, bridges, and other structures stronger, safer, and less vulnerable. We're developing strategies to shorten response times and get people out of danger quickly. We're promoting best practices to minimize the impact and disruption caused by these events. And we're working to improve codes and standards that better protect both lives and property. Together, NIST and its partners are working with communities to ensure that the next time an extreme event lands a punch, we stay on our feet, we bounce back.
So the NIST report provides an executive summary. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If you read the executive summary and study that in great detail, you'll get most of what you need out of this NIST report. However, I don't want you just to read the executive summary. I do want you to look at each of the chapters. But the executive summary does a great job of showing the key aspects of what this report is all about. And what this report is about is a 6-step process to planning for community resilience. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that you need to know all of these steps, and you need to have a good sense as to what happens under each of these steps. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because you'll note that after the midterm exam, you will still have some readings from this report. And you may think, oh, I may only need to know step 1 or 2 for the midterm. That's not true. You need to know all 6 steps, and you need to be at least familiar with what's underneath these steps for the midterm. So be sure that you study them and know them in order. So, number one, the first step is to form a collaborative planning team. Number two is to understand the situation, including social dimensions, built environment, and link social functions and the built environment. Number three is to determine goals and objectives. Number four is the plan development. Number five is the plan preparation, review, and approval. And number six is the plan implementation and maintenance. Figure 1.2 in the NIST report talks about the community capitals framework. Basically, a community is comprised of multiple capitals, which is what they call. There's financial capital, there's built capital, there's political capital, social capital, human capital, cultural capital, and natural capital. Basically, all of these capitals, and of course here they're defining capitals as resources or assets, all of these together help to form the resources of the community in totality. Now, when we take a look at the social functions of a community and how the social functions of a community define the functional requirements of a community's buildings and infrastructure systems, we can see in Figure 1.3 that the various aspects of a community, such as the economy, the education, the health sector, community and service, media, religious and cultural beliefs, government, family, all of these have functional requirements which draw upon the energy, transportation, communications, water and wastewater, and buildings of that particular community. Now, this report says, for instance, after a significant event, can residents remain in their homes? Can governments communicate with residents to inform them and support the recovery efforts? Can businesses and factories resume operations within a reasonable period? These types of social needs determine the performance expected from a community's buildings and infrastructure systems. So, for communities to prosper, they need these infrastructure systems to be operational. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, having lived through Hurricane Katrina, that a lot of these systems, transportation, communications, water and wastewater, buildings, energy, a lot of these collapsed during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It led the economy to come to a halt. Education stopped. Healthcare was disrupted. Families were devastated. Government was not functioning properly. Religious and cultural systems, were impacted. The Archdiocese of New Orleans had to close many churches after Hurricane Katrina. But at the same token, a lot of the community services and the religious and cultural services helped to band together to rebuild these systems. So media was disrupted. There was no, it was hard to get information about what was occurring. So when a major disaster strikes, a big major disaster, a lot of these systems can fail. Now, if one system fails, it's easier and quicker to recover. If multiple systems fail, it becomes increasingly challenging because of the interdependence between the systems. Transportation does not work without communications. Energy supplies power for buildings and for transportation and for communications and for water and wastewater. So as you can see, systems are intertwined and interconnected. And So, for example, on September 11th, as devastating as it was to the United States, it was really a breakdown of one or two systems, maybe three systems. Obviously, the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon were attacked. Those buildings collapsed. Didn't impact all buildings, but it certainly had some major impacts to some very important buildings. Transportation system was brought to a halt. Communication systems, for the most part, worked fairly well. The energy system was not disrupted. The water and wastewater systems, for the most part, were not disrupted. So we did bounce back quicker, but yet it was still a major blow, and we didn't rebound immediately. It took some time. But in Hurricane Sandy, for example, the damages were much more widespread. The buildings, the energy, transportation, communications, water and wastewater, all of these systems during Superstorm Sandy were impacted more so than the 9/11 example. And all of this relates to, again, the economy, the healthcare sector, the media, family, government, and so on. So this is more or less the diagram that defines resilience. We have time located along the x-axis. And as we're plotting along, we can see that there are, I'll use my cursor here, there is an aging system, which means infrastructure's functionality is decreasing. Or we might be maintaining our system, in which case functionality remains constant. Or we may be improving our system, which means functionality of our various systems is getting better. At some point, we have this hazard event during a time period right here. The hazard event leads to reduced functionality. And then, over time, there is the performance goal of trying to minimize or get back to full recovery as quickly as possible. So the time to full recovery in this particular scenario, where functionality is lost down to some point that is about half the functionality as normal, it then recovers back up to full functionality, and this right here is the time period for full recovery. They also call this the triangle of resilience. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. In this other scenario, there was a hazard event and functionality decreased way more than 50%. In this case, it looks like it's more like it was knocked down to about 25%. And because of the damage that was impacted and the increased lost functionality, it took longer to get back to full functionality. And that triangle of resilience is larger. Okay, now the idea of resilience is how can we create plans both before a hazard and after a hazard in order to reduce the triangle of resilience. Now I don't think you're going to see that term so much here. I've seen that in other work more so. But more or less, the smaller your triangle becomes, the quicker you're back to full state recovery, full functionality. Now, after a disaster strikes, you can see that you could recover quicker. And that is based on administrative and construction solutions for community resilience. Or you can make decisions that make you recover slower. And you could see both of those options here, right? This one recovers much quicker here as opposed to this scenario, which recovers much slower. That difference there could be, could be a year or longer. What I like to point out in terms of planning is we can take steps ahead of time to try and improve our resilience, improve our functionality, so that way when a disaster strikes, we can recover faster. The higher you are up on here, the quicker you get back to full functionality. Of course, you need to make decisions after the disaster as well. So this is a really important graphic. I really want you to make sure you understand this graphic, as this will be coming up to you on the midterm exam. So really make sure you understand all of the elements within this graphic here. Table 1.1 extends upon this with looking at the system condition at the time of the hazard affects the degree of damage and lost functionality. So this is the, I'm trying to go back here. This is the degree before a hazard affects it afterwards. So in condition A, experiences a modest loss of functionality after the event. The system is well maintained. It benefited from good design and mitigation projects, improved level of functionality before a hazard event, and modest loss of functionality after the event, as opposed to condition B that had increased vulnerability to the hazard relative to condition A, degradation of functionality, deterioration in the physical system, and lack of adequate maintenance. So this now gets into, again, the 6 steps for planning community resilience. Step 1 is to form a collaborative planning team, and this is what's talked about in detail in Chapter 2. The key activities underneath this step is to identify resilience leader for the community, identify team members and their roles and responsibilities, identify key public and private stakeholders for all phases of planning and implementation. The second step, understanding the situation, looks at social dimensions, the built environment, and then linking the functionalities of the social to the built environment and defining building clusters and supporting infrastructure. Now, under the social dimensions, they talk about identifying and characterizing functions and dependencies of social institutions, including business, industry, and financial systems, based on individual social needs met by these institutions and social assets and vulnerabilities. Identify how social functions are supported by the built environment. Identify key contacts and representatives for evaluation, coordination, and decision making. Under the built environment, there's to identify and characterize buildings and infrastructure systems, including condition, location, and dependencies among systems. Identify key contacts, representatives, and evaluation, coordination, and decision-making activities, and identify existing plans to be coordinated with the resilience plan. Now, I'm sorry that I'm reading all of these bullets one at a time, but I'm doing it deliberately for a reason. That reason is that I want you to make sure that you know this information. Make sure you study these. Make sure you know what goes under each one of these. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how these things work in the real world. Forming a collaborative planning team is so critical. There are so many different stakeholders in a community. It's a role of the planners to work to pull all of these stakeholders together into an effective planning team, okay? Not all groups that represent all different aspects of the communities are effective. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, the mayor put together a team called the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. Bring New Orleans Back Commission did a lot of work, and they identified a lot of really important things that needed to happen to recover quickly. But they also got a little sidetracked. They started to look at long term projects like building light rail systems and creating walkable, sustainable communities, which I'm a big proponent of all of those things. Don't get me wrong, those are really important. However, after Katrina, when the Mayor's Bring New Orleans Back Commission was presenting their information to the public, they started to focus on those long term goals, the transportation plans of the future, the land use plans of the future. And unfortunately, that didn't resonate very well with the public that came to this meeting. Now, keep in mind, this meeting was held about 4 or 5 months after Hurricane Katrina. Many people hadn't yet been back in their homes, or if they had, they maybe just came back to gut their homes from the flood damage, and they were still struggling with insurance companies to figure out how they could get money to rebuild their homes. They were still trying to navigate, figure out what government programs could help them. At that point, there wasn't a lot of good information. People were frustrated. The mayor's team presented the findings of their plans. Now, granted, the planning team that they put together was fairly collaborative, and it just represented mostly the upper echelon of the public and private sectors. Not to say that others were excluded, but they just by nature didn't really have the ability to engage because the planning process at that point for the Bring New Orleans Back Commission didn't make a real strong effort at that point yet to reach out to the general public to get their input. This is before the Unified New Orleans Plan, which I talked about last week. So this team of relatively elite business leaders and high-level government folks and high-level socially connected individuals such as leaders of churches or leaders of nonprofit organizations sat down and over a period of 4 or 5 months put together a good plan, or at least they thought it was a good plan. Well, they failed to understand the situation, particularly the social dimensions of the situation. And the problem that they had is that they didn't quite grasp the needs that the public had in being able to rebuild and recover the basics that they needed in their lives. So think about this. The commission puts together a presentation in public for the first time. In most senses, it was the public's first time to become face to face with any kind of a government entity, including local, state, and federal agencies. So the number of people that came to New Orleans for this meeting was staggering, and I was in the room for this meeting. There were probably thousands of people that came to the meeting, and most of them couldn't get in. And the government didn't even plan for the fact that that many people would show up. But they did because it was their first and only opportunity after months to be able to go and tell somebody what they needed. And what did they need? They needed basics. They needed electricity. They needed the local government to come up with a clear policy on why were they demolishing some people's homes. Some of the homes were deemed at risk of collapse. So the government was coming in and just demolishing the buildings without, in many cases, even talking to the homeowners themselves. And there was a lot of questions about that, as you could imagine. there were concerns about how could they navigate the insurance process to get the money from insurance companies that were giving them the runaround. There were a lot of questions about how to get money from the federal government in terms of assistance to rebuild their homes and rebuild their businesses. And the planners there at that meeting talked about the long term recovery. They talked about building wonderful light rail systems and walkable mixed use communities where people can work and shop and live all in the same place. Now, eventually, a lot of that stuff has happened. If you go to New Orleans today, that's what has happened, but that's not the right time and the place for that particular conversation. Okay, once you get through the collaborative planning team and understanding the situation, you need to determine goals and objectives. Establish the long term community goals. Now, there is, again, a time and a place for long term community goals, but lots of times you need to address the short term needs before you can address the long term goals. Establish desired recovery performance goals for the built environment at the community level based on societal, social needs, and dependencies and cascading effects between systems. To this point, I'd like to really tell you a little bit about the major earthquakes that rocked Christchurch, New Zealand. I think about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago now, there were a series of major earthquakes, many earthquakes, in fact, that struck Christchurch, New Zealand over and over and over again over a period of a year or maybe even 2 years. In fact, the earthquakes were so bad that certain neighborhoods, the ground liquefied, and people couldn't even rebuild in those neighborhoods. There were most of the downtown of Christchurch was absolutely devastated, including major iconic historic uh, buildings there. They had a beautiful church downtown called Christchurch, which I believe was completely destroyed. And as a result of the recovery, a lot of emphasis was placed in establishing the recovery metrics for the built environment at the community level. And I've been to Christchurch before the earthquake. I haven't been there since, but I've seen some really excellent presentations about the folks who were working to rebuild New Zealand, rebuild Christchurch, New Zealand. And they had to use metrics to monitor the performance of streets, traffic, for example, and buses, for example. So imagine you have a major earthquake that hits an entire metropolitan city like Christchurch, New Zealand. And you still have to, after the earthquake, you still have people living there. They need bus service. They need to be able to go from point A to point B in their cars. But a lot of the roads are damaged and destroyed. So they had to put together information for people about which roads were open and which roads were closed and how that would impact the bus service or just traffic in general. So all of these different elements of the recovery required performance goals and information. And then, of course, the dependencies and cascading effects between these systems, as you can imagine. They help to define community hazards and the levels and determine the anticipated performance during and after a hazard to support social functions, and then of course summarizing the results. So that's all under the determine goals and objectives, which is basically chapter 4. Chapter 5 lays out the plan development, and within this particular step, there is a need to evaluate gaps between the desired and anticipated performance of the built environment to improve community resilience, to summarize results, to identify solutions to address gaps, including both administrative and construction options, and to prioritize solutions to develop an implementation strategy. Again, going back to the Christchurch, New Zealand example, the construction managers very much had to develop a solution that was basically constructible. What I mean by that is that if you had certain roads that were damaged, people needed to get around town, they had to come up with a phasing strategy as to which roads to fix so that could minimize the people's ability to go across town, but at the same time still repair the streets that were needed. In fact, same thing happened in New Orleans over the last few years. A lot of the streets downtown were eligible for federal recovery dollars, and it took many years for that money to come. Probably 7 or 8 years. And then once the money came, it was there all at once. So all of a sudden, every street was under construction all at the same time, and it became a nightmare to be able to get around town. In many cases, it's still that way. A lot of these big hazard mitigation projects that are replacing their flood systems and underground stormwater drainage systems require the entire street to be ripped up. And in many cases, there are many streets that are ripped up, all in a similar part of town. And in that case, it wasn't coordinated very well and became really difficult and challenging for people to get around town. And this isn't something that just is for like a few days or a week. We're talking about streets that are closed and torn up. Imagine in the context of South Florida, Congress and military and Jog Road, all being closed for miles on end, not just for a few days or weeks, but literally for 2 years. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's kind of hard to imagine if you've not lived in that sort of an environment. But I would recommend, if you're interested in this topic, to go live in a place that is recovering from a disaster, so you can see firsthand what all of these reports and books are telling us, and you could really get a good understanding for it. I wouldn't just go there and squat. I mean, given the fact that you are in a program, you could probably get a good job working in the recovery. So anyway, the fifth step is the plan preparation, review, and approval. That should be document the community plan implementation strategy, obtain feedback and approval from stakeholders in the community, and finalize the approval plan. And then 6 is to plan implementation and maintenance, execute approval, administrative and construction solutions, evaluate and update on a periodic basis, modify short or long-term implementation strategy to achieve performance goals as needed. Now, one thing that I'd like to point out is that there's often a tension between planning and implementation. The more time you take to plan in a deliberate way, which often results in a better outcome, the longer it can take to recover after you've experienced a disaster, which can create frustration for those who want to see quick recovery. And of course, most people want to see recovery happen quickly. This is the problem that we experience, particularly in the United States, is that most cities and communities do not plan ahead of time for major disasters. So after a disaster, they are trying to recover and plan at the same time. Now, if communities are foresighted and they plan ahead of having a disaster, they could eliminate the need for trying to develop the community input and the community, what's the word I'm looking for? Where the community comes together and agrees upon by and large, a set of principles and a set of projects they want to see happen. Of course, not everyone agrees, but the majority of the people, come to some sort of a desired uh, outcome in the planning process. If you're doing all of that, which again, this is what New Orleans did during the context of a major disaster recovery, it does slow down the recovery. Now, if you do a lot of this work ahead of time, then you don't have to do it after the disaster because it's already been done. And you can recover quicker. Hence, what that concept of resilience is all about, minimizing the time to get back to full functionality. So, let's get in a little bit more into step one, which is the second chapter, or it's not even really chapters, it's kind of a section in the NIST report. Form a collaborative planning team. Again, I already kind of went through all of this, so I don't want to repeat myself here, but I want to just point out that it's incredibly important to put a planning team that has a wide array of representation from government, nonprofit, and private sectors. The team should be diverse in terms of age, gender, race, ethnicity, geography, and pretty much any other dimension that you could think of. So, why is it important to have diversity in these planning teams? This is not a politically correct endeavor, although that is important, of course, to have representation in order to have just representation across different groups for the sake of having representation. No, the reason that it's so important is because representation from diverse groups that cast a wide net and bring together literally as many voices in the community as possible is because if you don't do that, you're going to get resistance and you're going to get fought when you put a plan out into the public and groups come forward and say, we haven't been consulted. And then there's going to be a fight, and there's going to be obviously some sort of revised plan that comes out that hopefully captures the desires of the non-represented groups who weren't part of the planning team. But if the planning team brings everyone into the camp from the beginning, then you can avoid that painful step, which can cost valuable time during a recovery. Some examples of local government stakeholders who could be included in the planning team include, the office of the mayor, city council. Now, this may sound kind of intuitive, but believe me, intuitive does not always happen in the real world. I'll give you a good example. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, I told you about the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. Well, the mayor, which operates independently and is elected independently from the city council, it's a strong mayor form of government. He did not include any of the city council in the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. So the city council got annoyed and they went, because they control the legislative functions and the budgetary approval of the mayor's budget in New Orleans. And they went out and they had the City Planning Commission, which in New Orleans is housed under the city council as opposed to under the mayor's office, which is, I think, relatively unique. I think in most cities, the planning department is actually housed underneath the administrative side or the executive side. Well, in New Orleans, it's oddly housed under the legislative branch. I don't know why. I think that's not normal. It's not common. So the Bring New Orleans Back Commission didn't include really the official representation of the city council or the city planning commission as a part of that. So then, of course, the city planning commission and the city planning commission is underneath the city council. They got annoyed, and after the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, they went off and did their own set of plans and hired a consultant, actually a consultant out of Miami by the name of Lambert, and he came and did a bunch of plans for the city planning commission and the city council. Well, of course, those plans aren't going to be adopted in fully either because they didn't have the mayor's buy-in, and then hence that's what led to that unified New Orleans plan that we talked about last week. So what may seem just an obvious thing that the mayor and the city council should coordinate doesn't always happen in the real world. I know it seems crazy and idiotic, but the real world is full of crazy and idiotic things. Here, this list shows building departments, Department of Public Works, fire departments, Parks and Recs, Public Utilities Commission, Planning Department. You would be amazed at how each of these particular rows, each of these departments, in many cities don't coordinate or even talk to one another. And when it comes time to recover from a disaster, they need to talk to one another. Department of Public Works needs to coordinate with fire department, right? Fire department needs water in order to put out fires. But if the water lines are broken, the fire department can't get their water, and the Department of Public Works needs to coordinate with the fire department, of course, in order to figure out, which places can they tank water to, which places do they need to just hook up a hose to a fire hydrant and things like that. Parks and Recreation, Public Utilities, Planning Department, Emergency Management Agencies, Boards of Education, Human Services Department. All of these agencies in many cities are often silos. They're often insulated and buffered from one another, and people often don't work well together, or they just don't have a history of working together. So building that collaboration across government agencies before disaster strikes can be incredibly important and useful after a disaster strikes. Outside of the confines of government, we have chambers of commerce, community business districts, building owners, managers, utility providers, health agencies, architects and urban planners, engineers, developers, and other construction professionals, and other media that should all be included in a collaborative planning team. Then there's non-governmental organizations, there's VOADs or voluntary organizations active in disaster. Not all places utilize this. This is a Red Cross program, I believe, but really useful and important when you have these groups. These are nonprofit, nonpartisan, membership-based organizations that help build resilience in communities nationwide. Sounds all wonderful, pie in the sky, but even within VOADs, there are politics. I'll give you an example. I was meeting up in New York last spring. I was interviewing some folks that were very instrumental in Hurricane Sandy recovery. One organization is called the World Care Center. They were formed after 9/11, and their mission is to coordinate spontaneous volunteers during September 11th terrorist attacks, after the terrorist strikes, for many, many months, and even beyond months into the years, there were a whole bunch of spontaneous volunteers that said, we want to help. Well, who coordinates the volunteers? Whoever thinks about how do you manage thousands and thousands of volunteers? Well, World Care Center was created by a woman named Lisa Orloff. she saw this problem and said, we need to do something about this. So she created a nonprofit, organized all these volunteers. Well, make a long story short, Hurricane Sandy comes, not quite a decade, or yeah, actually, no, it was over a decade after 9/11. Her organization had been around for a long time, gotten a lot of good publicity for the work that she did. She expanded out of New York, worked in New Orleans, worked in other cities that had floods, went to Haiti, helped with the, coordinating volunteers after the earthquake there, spoken all over the world, wrote a book about all of this. Anyway, she was telling me that in New York City during Hurricane Sandy, the VOADs didn't want to let groups like hers and other groups into the conversations because the VOAD in New York was consistent of a group of nonprofit organizations that all met on a regular basis and they coordinated amongst themselves. These are organizations like the Red Cross and other organizations that are do this on a typical day-to-day basis. And at first, they were resistant to having some newcomers come and sit in on their party. Well, over time, the guards were let down, and eventually they did, they were let in to participate in the VOAD conversations, but it didn't happen overnight. It took time. And again, this could have happened before Superstorm Sandy, but it didn't because nobody thought ahead of time to try to cast a wide net of the VOADs, and it was the same typical people coming together. But after a major disaster like Hurricane Sandy, there was a need for more organizations to participate, and again, there was some resistance to that happening, but that was eventually changed for the better, but it took time, and time is critical when you're recovering from a major disaster. Community associations. I don't know how many of you are a part of your neighborhood organization. If you are, you probably know that these too can be very insular and cliquey. But again, it's so important during or after a disaster to be able to have communications with the folks in your community. A lot of times, for example, renters are not included in neighborhood organizations. Most neighborhood organizations consist of homeowners, but renters are just as important, especially after a disaster when people need to get back to their homes. Does it matter if they own or they rent? It's still their home. Their stuff is there. And often vulnerable populations are not included in these conversations. Community service organizations and religious and cultural groups is another group. So what the NIST report is saying is that these are all the different types of groups that should be collaborating together, not I'm kind of digging a little bit deeper and talking about some of the issues and concerns within each of these organizations. So there's things that can happen both across these different types of stakeholder groups and, as I'm suggesting, ways to improve the effectiveness within these groups as well. Step 2 in the NIST report is to understand the situation, identify, characterize the social dimensions, characterize the built environment, and link social dimensions to the built environment. These are all described in the report here, and I'm just going to kind of move on to the next one. That's basically step 2, as I talked about here. I'm not going to get super deep into that. The key thing really here is that you know the steps and you know the highlights, the key bullets under each one of those steps. That's what you really need to know for the midterm. The structure of the midterm, what's the format and what should you study? Well, make sure you study the material that was on quizzes 1 and 2. and the questions from this unit. So you will get randomly selected questions from quizzes 1 and 2 in a multiple choice format, or not all multiple choice, but basically, the types of same questions that were on quizzes 1 and 2. You'll see some of those questions reappear in the midterm on part 1 with some new questions from this part, which if you've done the readings and you listen to this presentation, you'll be fine. But make sure you know the information. And then kind of, I think what is, I don't want to use the word fun because I know midterms are not fun, but this should be at least in engaging, that's probably a better word than fun, an engaging section of the midterm, which is scenario-based applied essay. You will be asked a scenario question. In this case, you will be a planner for a community. There will be a scenario, and you will need to write up an essay based on that scenario and based on your role for the community. And I'm not going to give you the answer, of course. I'm not going to give you the question, but the answer is basically just to take all the information that you've learned in the class up to this point and just apply it to that scenario. So, this is the end of the Unit 5 lecture. Thank you very much. I wish you good luck on the midterm exam next week, and see you soon.